A few years ago, I decided to go camping alone in a national forest about 3 hours outside my city. I had been working nonstop for months and desperately needed a break from everything. The idea was simple, just a quiet weekend in the woods. No phone calls, no traffic, no people, just silence. At least, that was the plan. But sometime after midnight on the first night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps slowly circling my tent. And the problem was, I knew there wasn't supposed to be anyone else anywhere near my campsite. At the time I was 26 and really into hiking and solo camping. I had done dozens of trips like this before. In fact, being alone in the woods was one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much. There's something peaceful about it. When you're far enough away from civilization, the world just feels different. The air is quieter. Your thoughts slow down. And after a while you start noticing things most people never pay attention to. The sound of wind through trees. The distant call of an owl. The way the forest settles into silence once the sun goes down. So camping alone never really scared me. At least, not before that night. The place I chose was a national forest about 3 miles down a dirt trail. It wasn't a designated campground, just a clearing that hikers sometimes used if they wanted to camp deeper in the woods. I had found it during a previous trip and liked how secluded it felt. To reach it, you had to hike through a narrow trail surrounded by tall pine trees. By the time you reached the clearing, the forest was so dense that you could barely see the sky through the branches, which meant there were no nearby cabins, no campsites, and no cell service. Exactly what I wanted. By the time I finished setting up my tent that afternoon, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The temperature dropped quickly once the light faded, and soon the entire forest was wrapped in that quiet blue darkness that comes just after sunset. I built a small campfire, heated up some canned food, and spent a couple hours just sitting there listening to the forest. It was calm, peaceful, nothing unusual at all. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't even know what had woken me. The inside of the tent was completely dark except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the fabric. For a few seconds I just lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard it. A soft crunch. Then another. Crunch, crunch. The unmistakable sound of someone stepping slowly on dry leaves. At first I thought it might be an animal. Deer pass through the forest all the time, and sometimes they wandered close to campsites looking for scraps of food. But something about the rhythm of the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were too slow, too deliberate. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps moved carefully through the leaves outside my tent. And then I realized something that made my stomach tighten. They weren't just walking past my campsite. They were moving in a circle around it. The sound shifted slowly from one side of the tent to the other, as if someone was pacing around the clearing. I stayed completely still inside my sleeping bag, listening, trying to figure out what was happening. After about 30 seconds, the footsteps stopped, right outside the front of my tent. For several seconds, nothing happened. No wind, no animals, just silence. Then I heard the faintest sound, the tent fabric rustling, something touching it, not hard, just a light pressure. Like someone leaning against the side of the tent. My heart started pounding immediately. Every instinct in my body told me not to move. Whoever, or whatever, was outside was close enough that they could probably hear even the smallest movement. The pressure against the tent shifted slightly. The thin nylon wall pushed inward for a moment, then relaxed. Then it happened again. A slow hand-shaped bulge pressed gently against the tent fabric. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't an animal. Someone was standing outside my tent. I reached slowly for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag. My hand was shaking so much it took me a second to grip it properly. Then I clicked it on. The beam of light lit up the inside of the tent immediately. For a brief moment, the fabric wall in front of me became translucent under the flashlight beam. And that's when I saw it. The outline of a person, standing right outside the tent. Close enough that I could see the shape of their shoulders and head through the fabric. They were completely still, just standing there, watching. The second the light hit the tent wall, the shadow vanished. Whoever it was moved away instantly. Then I heard rapid footsteps crashing through the leaves. Running. They disappeared into the forest within seconds. The clearing fell silent again. I sat there frozen for a long time. My flashlight beam was still shaking in my hand. Every few seconds I expected the footsteps to come back. But they didn't. The forest remained quiet for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep again. Not even for a minute. Every small sound made my heart jump. Branches creaking. Leaves shifting in the wind. Owls calling in the distance. Everything sounded like someone moving just beyond the trees. Eventually the sky started to lighten with the first gray hints of sunrise. The moment there was enough light to see clearly, I packed my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast. All I wanted was to get back to the trailhead and leave that forest. The hike back should have taken about an hour. But halfway down the trail I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the dirt. At first I assumed they were mine from the day before. But when I looked closer, they didn't match. They were larger, and they were facing the same direction I was walking, meaning whoever made them had been walking behind me, following the trail. Following me. I stopped and looked back down the path. The forest behind me was completely empty. No movement, no sound, just trees. But those footprints stayed visible in the dirt for several hundred yards before they finally disappeared. I never saw the person who was outside my tent that night, and I never went camping alone in that forest again. But sometimes, when I think about it late at night, I wonder something. If I hadn't woken up when I did, how long would that person have stood there, watching me sleep? Marcus and I had been planning that camping trip for weeks. We both needed a break from work, and one Friday afternoon we loaded up his truck and drove 4 hours out into the mountains. The farther we drove, the fewer cars we saw. Eventually the paved roads turned into dirt paths, and those paths narrowed into a single trail winding between thick forest and rocky hillsides. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the mountains. We hiked for nearly 2 miles before finding a spot to camp. It was a small clearing beside a quiet mountain lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the dark outline of the trees surrounding it. It was one of those places that feels untouched, like very few people had ever stood there. Marcus looked around and said, "Yeah, this is perfect." We set up our tents near the water and spent the evening cooking dinner over a small camp stove. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, and the forest around us grew darker and darker until eventually the only light came from our lantern. The mountains at night are a different kind of darkness. Without city lights anywhere nearby, the world becomes pitch black once the sun disappears. The trees form massive silhouettes against the sky, and the forest feels much bigger than it does during the day. After a while, the only sounds were the occasional ripple on the lake and the distant rustling of wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful. Exactly the kind of quiet we had been hoping for. Eventually we crawled into the tent and fell asleep. I'm not sure how much later it was when Marcus suddenly nudged me awake. "Hey," he whispered. His voice sounded tense. I opened my eyes slowly. "What?" "Look," he said quietly. I followed the direction he was pointing. Through the thin tent fabric, I could see a faint glow moving somewhere out in the forest. At first I thought I was still half asleep, but then I realized what I was seeing. A light. A small, dim light weaving between the trees. It looked like someone carrying a flashlight. I sat up slightly and squinted through the tent wall. The light moved slowly through the forest, occasionally disappearing behind tree trunks before reappearing again. Marcus whispered, "You see that too, right?" "Yeah," I said quietly. At first neither of us thought much of it. There were other hikers in the area sometimes. Maybe someone had set up camp somewhere nearby and was just walking around. But after a minute Marcus said something that made me uneasy. "Why isn't he on the trail?" I looked closer. He was right. The light wasn't following the hiking trail we had used earlier. Instead, it was moving directly through the forest. Between trees, over rocks, straight toward our campsite, and whoever was holding it was moving slowly, almost cautiously. We watched it in silence for a while. The beam drifted between the trunks of trees, getting closer little by little. Marcus reached over and quietly turned off the lantern inside the tent. Instantly we were swallowed by darkness. Now the only light visible was that strange glow in the forest. It moved closer, closer, until it reached the edge of the clearing. By now it was only about 30 feet away from our tent, but we still couldn't see the person holding it. Just the light. The beam swayed gently as if someone was standing there, holding it at waist height. Neither of us said a word. The entire forest had gone silent. Even the wind had stopped. Then the light moved again. One step closer, then another. Now it was just beyond the edge of our campsite. I held my breath. For several seconds the beam of light pointed directly toward our tent. Then suddenly it shut off. Just like that, the forest dropped into complete darkness. Marcus whispered, "Did he just turn it off?" "I think so." We waited. Neither of us dared to unzip the tent to look outside. Minutes passed. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No voices. No light. It was as if whoever had been standing there had simply disappeared. We stayed awake for nearly an hour after that. Eventually Marcus said quietly, "Maybe it was just another camper." "Yeah," I said, but neither of us sounded convinced. Eventually we fell asleep again. When morning came, sunlight poured through the trees and the forest looked completely normal again. Birds chirped along the lake and the mountains felt peaceful once more. For a while we almost convinced ourselves that we had imagined the whole thing. But then we decided to check the area where the light had been. We walked slowly to the edge of the clearing. The ground there was covered in soft dirt and fallen leaves. If someone had been standing there the night before, there should have been footprints. But there weren't. Not a single one. Marcus scanned the ground carefully. "You see anything?" "No," I said. We searched the area for nearly 15 minutes. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. No sign anyone had been there at all. And the strangest part was that the trail leading into the clearing was still undisturbed. If another camper had walked into our campsite that night, they would have had to use the trail. But the dirt path was completely smooth. No fresh marks. Nothing. Marcus and I packed up our gear not long after that. Neither of us mentioned the light much during the hike back. But every once in a while one of us would glance back toward the forest, as if expecting to see something following us between the trees. Even now, years later, we still talk about that night sometimes. And we always end up asking the same question. If there were no footprints, then what exactly was holding that light? The third story happened during a winter camping trip with a group of friends. There were 4 of us in total: me, Jake, Tyler, and my cousin Daniel. Instead of tents, we had rented a small cabin deep in the forest for a weekend hiking trip. It wasn't a fancy place, just an old wooden structure sitting in the middle of miles of snow-covered wilderness. To reach it, we had to drive nearly an hour down a narrow mountain road before finally reaching a small clearing where the cabin stood. The place felt remote. Really remote. The kind of place where once night falls, the world outside disappears completely. We arrived late in the afternoon and spent most of the evening inside, cooking food and talking while snow slowly drifted down outside the windows. By midnight the storm had stopped. The forest outside the cabin was perfectly still. The only light came from a small lantern sitting on the table. Outside the windows, the woods were completely black. At some point we all started getting ready to sleep. That's when we heard it. A sound outside. Soft at first, like someone stepping slowly through snow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. We all looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" Daniel asked. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah." The footsteps continued, moving around the cabin. Slow, heavy. It sounded like someone walking just outside the walls. Tyler frowned. "Did someone else rent another cabin out here?" Jake shook his head. "No. This is the only one." The footsteps stopped. For several seconds there was silence. Then we heard something else. A voice. Very quiet. Almost like a whisper. Calling a name. "Jake." Jake looked up immediately. "What?" The voice came again. Slightly louder this time. "Jake." The strange thing was, it sounded exactly like him. Like someone mimicking his voice perfectly. But Jake was sitting right next to us at the table. We all stared toward the door. The voice called again. This time it said Tyler's name. Then Daniel's. Each time it sounded eerily accurate. Like someone outside had been listening to us talk earlier and was now repeating our voices back to us. Tyler whispered, "Ugh, that's not funny." None of us laughed. The voice spoke again. This time it said my name. From just outside the door. We didn't open it. None of us even moved toward it. Instead, we stayed exactly where we were until the voice finally stopped. Eventually, the forest outside went quiet again. Morning came slowly. When sunlight finally lit up the windows, we stepped outside cautiously. The snow around the cabin was untouched except for our own tracks from the day before. But about 10 feet from the front door, we saw something strange. A set of footprints. They led directly toward the cabin, but they stopped abruptly in the middle of the snow. No turning around. No second trail leading away. Just footprints that ended suddenly, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished into the air. None of us ever figured out who or what had been calling our names that night, but sometimes I still think about that cabin, and the voice outside the door, calling us one by one, waiting for someone to answer.